At age 61, Davis Love III is still recognized in American golf history as one of the most consistent and durable players of the modern era. 21 PGA Tour wins spanning 3 decades, one major title at the 1997 PGA Championship, 2 Players' Championship victories, and one of the rare few to win on the PGA Tour in 4 different decades. He once held the world number 2 ranking, played in 6 Ryder Cups as a player, and later as captain, leading the U.S. team to victory in 2016, with discipline and absolute trust from the locker room. Davis Love III is also an icon of consistency. Over 700 PGA Tour starts, hundreds of top 10 finishes, a career built not on fleeting explosions, but on precision, driving power, and a rare moral standard. He was inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame and is respected by peers as someone who preserves the soul of American golf. No flash, no noise, no need to prove anything with words, but right when those numbers close, a cold emptiness opens up behind them, because achievements cannot hide the lifelong pain Davis Love III carries. His father, the strictest teacher, died suddenly in a plane crash in 1988, leaving a son who never got one final word of acknowledgement, forced to keep competing in silence and loss. His body gradually paid the price for years of playing golf with power and iron discipline. Back pain, fading stamina, every tournament becoming a quiet endurance test. No scandals to vent the pain, no breakdowns for sympathy. He only had quiet willpower, the kind that forced him to get up every day and keep living up to the standards his father once imposed. When his house burned down, taking mementos, trophies, and a lifetime of memories, Davis Love III didn't cry in public. He chose to protect his family, his dignity, his familiar silence. His strength isn't in winning more titles, it's in the ability to keep existing when the lights go out, when the world stops calling his name, when the pain has no audience, and when that very durability, the thing that built his great career, also becomes a burden he must carry to the end of his life. If you've ever believed that greatness isn't measured only by titles, but also by what a person endures in silence, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue the journey of Davis Love III. Born just one day after his father finished his round at the Masters, Davis Love III entered this world not with the carefree cry of a child, but with a destiny already written. Golf came to him before he could even realize who he was, before he understood what choice, dreams, or freedom meant. In the Love family, golf wasn't a sport. It was breathing, discipline, the measure of a person's worth. Davis Love Jr. wasn't the kind of father who dreamed about his son's future. He was the father who saw that path so clearly, he didn't need to ask if his son wanted to walk it. And so, Davis Love III's life was programmed in silence, with no starting moment, no fork in the road. A golf club appeared in his life as naturally as a spoon, shoes, or the need to stand straight and stay quiet when adults spoke. No one abused him, no one abandoned him, and that's exactly what makes this tragedy harder to name. He grew up in material comfort, surrounded by knowledge, technique, and the traditions of American golf. But love in that house always came with conditions. Not "are you happy?" but "did you hit it right?" Not "are you tired?" but "where did you go wrong?" Achievement became the only language for recognition, and silence became the reflex whenever feelings rose up. Davis learned to stand still, to listen, to correct mistakes, but he never learned to question his own life. In that world, dreaming wasn't forbidden. It was seen as a luxury, unnecessary, even dangerous, because dreaming meant choosing, and choosing meant the possibility of straying from the preset path. While other kids started imagining who they wanted to become, Davis Love III was already used to what he had to become. No moment of rebellion, no slammed doors, no shouts of protest. His compliance didn't come from fear, It came from the feeling that this was the only right thing to do, and in that rightness, a child gradually lost the right to be wrong, the right to be weak, the right to be confused. He learned silence before he learned to dream, learned to complete tasks before he learned to listen to himself. Every shot wasn't just technique, it was a test of worth. Every mistake wasn't just a technical error, it was a question about his very self. A childhood without deprivation, but locked inside a mold where emotions weren't banned, they were simply unnecessary. The tragedy of Davis Love III isn't that he was forced, it's that he was never asked. Golf didn't steal his childhood with violence. It did so with obviousness. It arrived too early, too perfectly in place, leaving no room for any other possibility. When you're born into a world where the path is already paved, continuing isn't a choice, it's a reflex. And when that reflex lasts long enough, it becomes identity, becomes something you can no longer distinguish from yourself versus the role assigned to you. Davis grew up not asking, "Who do I want to be?" but with a far heavier question, "Am I doing enough?" To outsiders, it looked like an ideal start, but in the inner silence of a child, it was the beginning of a life without the right to be wrong. Day by day, Davis Love III moved closer to the image others expected, while moving farther from the person he never got the chance to discover. He wasn't taught to dream his own dreams. He was taught to fulfill dreams that existed before he was born. And from there, the quiet tragedy took shape. A man who would later live a principled, successful, respected life, but always carrying an unnamed emptiness where there should have been the right to choose, the right to fail, and the right to dream like a normal human being. Davis Love III's father wasn't just a father. Davis Love Jr. was the first coach, the gatekeeper, the absolute measure of every value his son would carry for life. In their home, affection didn't disappear. It was always transformed into discipline. No long hugs, no spoken praise, no comfort in failure. Instead, there were long practice sessions, short questions, stern looks, reminding that every mistake must be fixed, and there was no room for weakness. Davis Love Jr. loved his son the way he believed was best, preparing him to become a real golfer, a man tough enough not to collapse under pressure. But in that kind of love, distance grew naturally, quietly, to the point neither of them named it. For Davis Love III, his father was never on the same level. He always stood higher, not through patriarchal power, but through absolute precision. Every shot Davis hit was scrutinized not for joy, but for flaws. Every time the ball veered offline, there was no sympathetic sigh, only cold analysis. Why it went wrong, how to fix it, never repeat it. Those moments repeated so often that Davis learned very early. Mistakes weren't for complaining about, but they were for taking responsibility. Emotions weren't forbidden, they just weren't prioritized. In Davis Love Jr.'s world, progress mattered more than comfort, and steadiness mattered more than fleeting joy. When Davis Love III started winning, it didn't change that order. Winning wasn't a reason for pride, it was a duty fulfilled. It was like showing up on time, doing your part, and moving on. No excessive celebrations, no moments to relax the role. A victory only mattered if it could be repeated, if it proved the path was right. And so Davis grew up in a quiet paradox. He always achieved what others expected, but rarely knew if he was being seen as a son or just as a project progressing well. In that relationship, Davis Love III never lacked his father's presence. His father was there for every practice, every tournament, every technical decision. But that presence took the form of a large shadow, covering but not embracing. Love wasn't absent. It just never reached the most fragile part of the sun. Davis learned to stand tall, to self-correct, to not seek verbal recognition. He learned that if he did well enough, silence was the answer. And so he stopped waiting for praise, stopped hoping for hugs, stopped asking if he was making his father proud. Instead, he set an even higher, stricter standard for himself, as if continuing his father's voice inside his own mind. The tragedy of this relationship wasn't conflict, it was the lack of collision. No big arguments, no public rifts, no clear breakdowns. Everything happened in order, in propriety, within the framework of a family seen as ideal. But that very ideal made the distance hard to see and hard to repair. Davis Love III grew up as an obedient son, an excellent student, but also as a child who didn't know how to question his own worth beyond achievements. He didn't learn to be comforted when tired, didn't learn to be weak when needed. He only learned to keep going because keeping going was the only thing recognized. Looking back, outsiders might say Davis Love Jr. did everything right. He didn't go easy on his son, didn't spoil him, didn't let emotions override discipline, and that rightness created an outstanding golfer, a principled man. But in that rightness, one small thing was overlooked: the need to be reached, to be seen not as a result, but as a person. Davis Love III didn't grow up lacking love. He grew up in a kind of love without warm shape, without gentle language. It existed like air, necessary, surrounding, but impossible to grasp. So for many years afterward, Davis Love III carried the feeling that he always had to measure up, not to be loved, but to not disappoint anyone. He stepped into every tournament knowing that each shot didn't just represent himself, but was the continuation of a standard set very early on. His father's love didn't disappear as he grew up, but it also didn't change shape. It still stood higher, still watched quietly, still needed no words. And in that unnamed distance, Davis Love III learned to live his entire life by one single rule: do it right, do it enough, and don't wait to be embraced. 1988 arrived without fanfare, but it closed off Davis Love III's youth with a shot that would never get a chance to be corrected. The small plane crashed, and his father, the teacher, the shadow that stood taller his whole life, vanished without goodbye. Davis was just 24. At an age when many are still searching for themselves, he was forced to face the cruelest truth. There would be no more practice sessions to fix mistakes with his father, no more stern looks from behind, no chance to hear one final word of acknowledgement, even just once. Death came faster than any reconciliation. The unsaid things were locked away forever, and silence, the thing he had learned since childhood, now became an unfillable void. There was no time to collapse. The schedule was still there. Tournaments kept going. The world didn't stop just because one son lost his father. Davis Love III walked onto the course in a state he couldn't even name, not fully devastated in the usual tragic way, but hollowed out from the inside. He didn't cry in public, didn't take long withdrawals, didn't allow himself to break, because in his mind, the familiar voice was still there. Stand tall, do it right, keep going. And so golf, the path that had once been programmed, now became a heavier duty than ever. No longer a means to prove anything, no longer a place to dream, but the only tether keeping him from slipping away from himself. Davis kept competing as a survival reflex. Every swing was a way not to think. Every round was a day passing without having to confront the loss head-on. He played golf to keep breathing, to maintain order in a world that had just lost its pillar. Outsiders saw professionalism, the admirable resilience of a young golfer overcoming personal tragedy. But inside, it was a son who hadn't yet emotionally matured, who hadn't gotten to say anything to his father, now forced to carry a void that was too big, no final praise to carry through life, no nod confirming he had done enough, only the memory of a standard, now with no one there to verify it, but still existing like a suspended sentence. His father's death didn't free Davis Love III from the pressure it locked him into it. When the one who set the standard was gone, the standard didn't vanish. It moved inside, becoming the strictest voice in his head. He didn't play golf to honor his father loudly, didn't turn the loss into an inspiring story. He played because if he stopped, everything would collapse. Golf became the discipline that kept him standing, but also the chain binding him to a life without emotional escape. Every tournament that passed was a reminder that he was continuing the path his father never got to say he was satisfied with or not. At 24, Davis Love III should have been allowed to be confused, allowed to be wrong, allowed to question his life. But the event of 1988 didn't give him that right. It pushed him into the role of a man too soon, forcing him to carry both the legacy and the pain in silence. Peers his age could turn to family, lean on parents through turning points. Davis could not. The only one who had ever stood higher, who had pointed the way, was gone forever. And from that moment, he understood there was no one left to ask, no one left to measure against. Every decision, every failure, every success from then on had to be borne alone. Some pains erupt, fierce, making people scream, then slowly recover. And there are other pains, quieter, more enduring, smoldering through the years. Losing a father is the second kind. It doesn't explode. It seeps into every habit, every round, every moment alone in the locker room. Davis Love III carried it like a missing part of his body, invisible, but always felt. He didn't try to fill that void with rebellion or recklessness. He filled it with discipline, with packed schedules, with relentless continuation. But the more he continued, the farther he got from the ability to stop and truly grieve. The greatest tragedy of 1988 wasn't just Davis Love Jr.'s death. It was the permanent end to any possibility of reconciliation. The unsaid things would never be said. The praise that might have existed in his father's mind would never be spoken. And the son had to live his whole life with an unanswered question. Had he done enough? Davis Love III played golf not to find that answer, but to avoid facing it. Every precise shot was a way to reassure himself. Every day on tour was a day he didn't collapse. From that moment, golf was no longer a path to the future. It was the only life preserver keeping Davis Love III afloat. He didn't swim to shore, didn't let go. He just floated, day after day, carrying a pain with no farewell ritual, no goodbye, no complete ending. And it was in that cold continuation that the axis of his life broke. Not loudly, not shattering before the world, but breaking inside, deep enough to shape the entire rest of a son's life, who played golf not to win, but to not collapse. After 1988, when his father vanished, and that unfillable void became a fixed part of his inner life, Davis Love III entered a phase that, to outsiders, was called building a career, but to him felt like an endless long walk with no stopping point. He played golf with rare consistency, week after week, year after year. No explosive moments that made the world turn its head. No instances that changed how people talked about the sport. Just solid rounds, regular top finishes, titles that arrived quietly and passed just as quietly as the way he existed. Davis Love III's career was built on a rock-solid foundation. But that foundation was too solid to create earthquakes. In a sports world increasingly obsessed with moments, with images, with easy-to-tell and easy-to-remember stories, Davis Love III wasn't a compelling narrative. He had no controversial personality for the press to exploit, no sharp quotes to spark waves, no impulsive behavior to become a generational symbol. He stepped up to the tee box, hit the ball, finished the round, and left. On time, properly, to standard. What he did was so standard, it was hard to stir strong emotion. People respected him, but rarely loved him. People acknowledged him, but didn't go wild for him. And in American sports culture, where public love often comes from drama, difference, and imperfect edges, Davis Love III gradually became a figure outside the zone of feeling. He wasn't defeated by crushing failures. He was overshadowed by louder names. Names with easier stories, harder falls, more spectacular comebacks gradually took over public memory space. Meanwhile, Davis was still there, still competing, still earning points, still standing firm. But that constant presence made people so used to him they stopped noticing. His success didn't carry the shape of tragedy or epic. It was more like a long, even line, and therefore hard to remember. No one stood up to say he'd been treated unfairly, because he was never treated badly. But no one stood up to defend him as a forgotten legend either, because he was never mythologized. Every win for Davis Love III came like a duty fulfilled, not like an event. He won. People noted it, then moved on to the next story. No new wave of fans formed around him, no cultural icon tied to his name. He didn't represent rebellion, didn't represent breaking norms. He was the norm. And ironically, in an era that celebrates difference, the norm is the hardest thing to love. Davis Love III became the image of a golfer everyone trusted, but few looked forward to. A name you weren't surprised to see on the leaderboard, but also didn't jump out of your seat for when he led. Success, for Davis Love III, gradually took the shape of a special kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of a failure left behind, but the loneliness of someone always in the top group, but rarely called first. He moved through seasons like an indispensable part of the landscape, like a lighthouse always lit, but because it's always there, it stops impressing. Colleagues respected him, learned from him, trusted him, but that respect didn't turn into adoration. And in elite sports, where legacies are often written with collective emotion, that meant his name easily slipped to the lower lines. Davis Love III didn't fight it. He didn't try to remake his image, didn't seek to make himself more appealing to the media. He kept playing golf the way he was taught. Do it right, do it enough, and let the results speak. But results, when not placed in a dramatic story, become silent. His career wasn't short on impressive numbers, but numbers don't create memory without emotion attached. And emotion, for the public, often needs something broken, jagged, or explosive. Davis Love III didn't give them that. He didn't break. He didn't explode. He just continued. There were afternoons when the tournament ended and the TV lights moved elsewhere. Davis Love III packed his gear and left the course in silence. No one held him back for long interviews. No one waited for a shocking quote. He didn't carry the full feeling of victory, nor the bitterness of defeat. Just another continuation of a long journey. And that very non-stop continuation, over time, became a burden. Because when you never explode, you never get released. When you always keep yourself in the frame, you never get the chance to step out of it and be seen another way. The tragedy of good enough but not famous enough for Davis Love III wasn't a tragedy of lacking ability, but the tragedy of a man who was too perfectly suited to what he did. He didn't create conflict with the world, and so the world didn't create a legend around him. His success became a prolonged form of loneliness, where you know you've done so many things right, but still feel like you're standing on the sidelines of a bigger story. And in that loneliness, Davis Love III kept playing golf not to be loved more, but because it was the only way he knew to survive in a world that had grown used to treating durability as a given. 1997 arrived like a belated promise, and Davis Love III stepped into the PGA Championship with everything he had accumulated over nearly a decade since his father's death. Discipline, endurance, silence, and a pain that had never been named. When he lifted his first and only major trophy, the golf world saw a perfect moment, a beautiful ending to the journey of a man who was good enough finally getting rewarded. To the audience, it was the peak. To history, it was a milestone. But to Davis Love III, that moment didn't bring the release. People still believe a big win can deliver. It didn't erase the past, didn't close the unanswered questions, didn't soothe the void that had formed back in 1988. The shiny trophy stood in front of him, but the only person he wanted to see in that moment was no longer there. The 1997 PGA Championship should have been the place where all the pressure melted away, where a son could finally tell himself he had done it, that he was enough. But no voice answered. His father was no longer there to witness it. No stern eyes from behind. No familiar silence he had learned to read as a form of acknowledgement. Instead, there was a cold emptiness, where the victory rang loud to the world, but echoed back to him like a sound in an empty room. Davis Love III stood at the summit he had gone so far to reach, and for the first time realized that some heights are so high you can't share the joy with anyone. No one asked if he was okay. The questions were about his swing, his strategy, his winning emotions, his career future. No one asked about the father who was gone, about playing golf through grief, about the years he kept competing just to not collapse. And Davis himself didn't speak. He was used to not speaking. He had been taught that emotions weren't something to display, especially in a moment when the whole world was applauding. So he smiled properly, answered correctly, and walked away like a true champion. But inside, no relief happened. Only a cold truth began to emerge. Even when you reach the absolute top, some losses can't be redeemed. The 1997 win didn't open a new era for Davis Love III the way people expected. It didn't free him from the shadow of the past, didn't bring inner freedom, didn't turn him into a cultural icon. It just added one more title to an already steady career, and one more proof that he could do everything right, even when his heart no longer had room to fully feel the joy. That peak was like a door opening to an empty room, where every clap got swallowed by silence, where victory stood there beautiful but without warmth. There was a painful paradox in that moment. Davis Love III had done exactly what he was taught he must do to deserve it. But when he finally got the biggest reward, he didn't know where to place it in his inner life. No father to share it with, no ritual to end nearly a decade of pain. He couldn't turn back time to bring that trophy to 1988, couldn't put it in the hands of the man who shaped his path. And so the victory didn't become liberation. It became a reminder that some things come too late to still heal. After the 1997 PGA Championship, Davis Love III kept competing, kept performing, kept being the image of consistency. But one thing had changed forever. He understood that no title was big enough to fill the void loss had created. The peak wasn't where every story ends. It was just a brief stop on a journey still heavy with weight. That win didn't turn him into a different person, didn't help him let go of the past. It only confirmed something he had quietly known for a long time. Golf could keep him standing, but it couldn't save him from what was lost. In the years that followed, when people talked about the 1997 PGA Championship as the brightest moment of Davis Love III's career, very few realized it was also the loneliest. Not because he stood alone on the podium, but because he stood there with a victory he couldn't share with the most important person. That peak wasn't a destination. It was painful proof that some lives, even when they take every step correctly, still can't find the peace they deserve. And from then on, every time he stepped onto the course, Davis Love III no longer played golf with the illusion that some big win would set him free. He played with the bitter clarity of someone who had stood at the top and realized the past couldn't be saved, no matter how bright the lights. After the 1997 peak, when victory didn't bring release, but only exposed an empty room inside, Davis Love III entered a phase where the tragedy no longer lay in memory or titles, but began carving directly onto his body. The back pain came not fiercely, not suddenly, but smoldering, patient, like a long reminder that the body has limits, even if the will refuses to admit it. The powerful swing that once was his pride, his technical signature that set him apart on tour, now became a burden that cost him with every swing. Every turn was a negotiation with pain, every round a test of endurance no one saw. Davis Love III didn't talk much about it. He was never one to complain. He had been taught since childhood that weakness wasn't something to expose, and silence was always seen as a higher form of discipline. He kept competing in pain not because he lacked options, but because he didn't know how to stop. Real rest had never been part of his life's vocabulary. Even when his body sent clear signals, he still saw it as something to overcome, not to listen to. On the PGA Tour, where the brutal pace allowed no hesitation, Davis Love III showed up on schedule, played every round, fulfilled the duty of an exemplary professional. Outsiders saw admirable durability. Few realized that beneath that calm exterior was a body slowly betraying him. Bit by bit, quietly, undramatically, but irreversibly. There were mornings he woke up with the pain already there before consciousness. His body no longer obeyed like before, but he still wore his familiar composure. He didn't allow himself to think he could weaken, because weakening meant facing things he had avoided his whole life: fragility, dependence, and the fear of no longer meeting the standard set so early. Davis Love III didn't fight the pain like a hero, didn't turn it into an inspiring, overcoming story. He just endured it quietly, the way he had endured everything else. And in that endurance, his body began speaking for the emotions he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Every small injury accumulated into a heavy burden. Every attempt to push past limits pushed him farther from feeling safe. But rest, for Davis Love III, wasn't just a medical decision, it was a moral challenge. Stopping meant admitting he was no longer strong enough, and that went against everything he had been raised to be, everything he had built himself into. He wasn't permitted to be weak, not because anyone forbade it, but because inside him there was always an unrelenting standard. That standard no longer wore his father's face, but it was still there, invisible and stricter than ever. As his body gradually lost flexibility, Davis Love III was forced to adjust not just technique, but expectations too. The swings were no longer as free as before, the rounds no longer as complete as in memory. He knew he was aging, knew he was paying the price for years of playing golf with power and iron discipline, but knowing didn't mean accepting. Inside him still lived a quiet resistance, a belief that if he kept going long enough, if he tried just a little more, everything would be okay. And that very belief made the decline lonelier, because he didn't share it with anyone, didn't seek sympathy, didn't allow himself to stop and truly grieve. In the locker room, among younger, faster faces, Davis Love III became the image of a man trying to keep pace with time. No one mocked him, no one pushed him away. But the difference grew clearer. His body carried the marks of a different generation, a different way of playing, a different philosophy. And in that difference, the pain wasn't just in his back, it spread to his mind. Every time he had to adjust expectations, every time he accepted he wasn't what he used to be, was another time he had to let go of a piece of the identity that had been with him since childhood. His body began saying what he wouldn't say. It said that durability has its price. It said that discipline, when stretched too long, can become punishment. It said that some limits can't be overcome by will alone. But Davis Love III still listened to his body in his own way, not to stop, but to know how much longer he could endure. He didn't seek pity, didn't expect recognition for that silent pain. He just wanted to keep existing in the role he was familiar with, even as that role demanded more and more from a failing body. The tragedy of this phase wasn't any specific injury, it was the accumulation. Physical pain piled onto inner silence, forming an inescapable loop. The body weakened, but the spirit wouldn't allow stopping, and that very contradiction wore him down day by day. Davis Love III didn't collapse on the course, didn't leave the tour in tears, didn't have a breakdown moment for the world to notice. He just slowed, bit by bit, while still trying to maintain the appearance of a man in control of everything. Perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the back pain, but the quiet realization that his body, the thing he had once trusted, absolutely, had now become the first opponent he couldn't defeat. And in that confrontation, He had no clear strategy, no decisive shot, only time, the pain, and a man who was used to staying silent in the face of every challenge. Davis Love III kept stepping onto the course, not to prove anything to the world, but to keep himself from collapsing. And it was in that deeply contradictory continuation that his tragedy became clearer than ever. A man who had done everything right, endured everything in silence, and now had to listen to his body speak the truth he had never allowed himself to admit. When his body began to betray him, and time no longer stood on his side, Davis Love III stepped into another role, one that for many was the pinnacle of honor, but for him became a new form of loneliness. Ryder Cup captain. There, he no longer stood on the tee box to take responsibility for his own shots. He had to carry an entire team, with different egos, different pressures, and heavy expectations from an American golf establishment that always demanded victory. Becoming captain didn't give Davis Love III a sense of power, because he had never sought power. It gave him a more familiar burden, responsibility that couldn't be shared. When the team won, he stepped back, giving the spotlight to the young golfers, to team spirit, to the collective moment. When the team lost, he stepped forward, took the blame, took the responsibility. No excuses, no finger-pointing, no justifications. In that world, leadership wasn't about being protected. It was about becoming the one who absorbs the hits. Davis Love III led the Ryder Cup with the same philosophy he had lived his whole life: silence, discipline, and absolute trust in standards. He didn't deliver fiery speeches to make a personal mark, didn't turn himself into a media icon. He chose to listen, to keep order, to stand among strong egos without needing to raise his voice. But that very choice made his role invisible in a different way. When everything went smoothly, no one remembered the captain. When things went wrong, all eyes turned to him immediately. And in those moments, Davis Love III stood alone, just as he had always stood throughout his career, amid unspoken expectations and silent judgments. In the Ryder Cup, every missed putt or lost match by a young golfer came with scrutinizing looks toward the leader. Davis Love III understood that very clearly. He wasn't just responsible for strategy, he was responsible for morale, for personnel choices, for the atmosphere in the locker room. When a putt missed, when a match slipped away, the unspoken questions still hung in the air. Had he done enough? Had he chosen right? And as always, he didn't try to answer with words. He answered by stepping up to take the blame, by shielding his golfers, by keeping them from facing the storm of public opinion alone. That was how he understood leadership. Not to be celebrated, but to absorb pressure so others could keep going. Davis Love III's loneliness in the captain's role didn't come from betrayal or lack of respect. It came from the very nature of the position and from his own character. He didn't seek allies to share the emotional burden, didn't seek public comfort. He was too accustomed to carrying things alone from the day his father died, through the years of playing golf in silence, through the back pain he never spoke about. The Ryder Cup only exposed that more clearly. In closed-door meetings, when the doors shut and the TV lights went off, Davis Love III was still the last one left, thinking about the decisions he had made, the things he might have done differently, the results he couldn't change. There were no applause in those moments, only prolonged self-questioning. When the U.S. team won, Davis Love III didn't turn himself into the face of success. He talked about the golfers, about team spirit, about collective effort. He stood in the back, as if that was the most natural position for him. But when defeat came, he stepped forward with a calm that many mistook for being unaffected. In reality, every loss carved deeper the feeling that leadership, for him, was a duty with no emotional reward. No one asked if he was tired. No one asked if he could handle it. People only asked, who's responsible? And Davis Love III was always the one who answered that question with himself. In the most prestigious role in team golf, He wasn't shielded by personal glory. He had no shield of a mythologized legend, no leniency given to bigger icons. He only had moral credibility, something fragile and easily eroded when results didn't meet expectations. And that credibility, instead of protecting him, forced him to be even stricter with himself. Every wrong decision, no matter how small, became its own burden, not shared, not lightened. Davis Love III didn't avoid responsibility, but he also had nowhere to put it down. There was a bitter paradox in his Ryder Cup journey. The very qualities that made him trusted with the responsibility, his calm, discipline, lack of showmanship, only made his loneliness deeper. He had no explosive moments to release pressure, no individual role to fall back on. He only had the leadership role, and that role demanded he always stay steady, even when inside he was starting to wear down. His body spoke its fatigue through the pain, but his spirit still wouldn't allow weakness. In the locker room, in front of the young golfers, he was the rock. But when everyone left, he returned to his familiar silence. For Davis Love III, the Ryder Cup wasn't a stage to etch his name in history with personal triumphs. It was a moral test, where he had to face his own limits in the role of carrying responsibility for others. Leading in loneliness, that was what he did, without a single complaint, without a single demand for recognition. And just like many other phases in his life, that prestigious role didn't bring him a sense of protection or release. It only extended a silent tragedy. A man who always stood at the front line when things went wrong, but was rarely allowed to stay in the light when things went right. After the Ryder Cup, when the collective responsibility had been laid down, but the loneliness remained intact, Davis Love III stepped into a golf world that had begun to change so much he realized he no longer belonged at its center. Golf entered the era of data and commerce, where every swing was measured by numbers, every decision backed by algorithms, and every story had to be fast enough, sharp enough, compelling enough to survive in the nonstop media flow. Analysis rooms replaced quiet practice sessions, dense stat sheets replaced gut feel, and young faces appeared with massive teams behind them. In that new picture, the values Davis Love III represented, discipline, standards, silence, responsibility, suddenly seemed slow, hard to tell, and therefore outdated. No one eliminated him. There was no announcement saying he no longer had a place. No door slammed shut. He was still respected, still invited, still mentioned with polite words. But the change of the era happened in a far more subtle way. It made him unnecessary. When golf needed more entertaining faces, stories that could spread faster, Davis Love III wasn't suited to be the center. He didn't fight that change, didn't try to adapt by turning himself into a different version. He stood there, observed, and gradually understood that he was surviving through his own era. In the new era, value was measured by speed and reach. Those who spoke loudest were heard first. Those who created controversy were remembered longer. Davis Love III didn't have that. He wasn't a pop culture icon, wasn't a face for disruption. He didn't represent a revolution. He represented an old order that had worked very well for decades. But old orders are rarely mourned when new ones arrive. And so, without anyone pushing, Davis Love III drifted to the edge, not because of failure, but because he no longer fit the story golf wanted to tell about itself. There is a special pain in being left behind when no one deliberately left you. No rival to blame, no system to resist. Only the slow realization that the things you believed in, the things you lived fully, were gradually losing value in the world's eyes. Davis Love III didn't complain about it. He was used to not being wildly loved, used to standing behind the lights. But this change was different from everything before. It wasn't just being forgotten, it was being replaced. Golf no longer needed someone like him to function. It needed new images, new stories, new data. And he, all his standards and durability, became something like a living relic, respected but not used. In meetings, at big events, Davis Love III still appeared with his familiar calm. He listened to conversations about technology, optimization, global commercial strategy. He understood them. He didn't object, but he also understood that wasn't the language that had shaped who he was. He came from an era where the feeling before an important shot couldn't be replaced by charts, where decisions didn't just come from data, but from intuition forged over years. In the new world, that intuition was no longer prioritized, and so he quietly stepped back, not because he weakened, but because he knew he was no longer in the right time. The tragedy of Davis Love III's era wasn't that he was brutally sidelined. It was that he was still there, still present, but no longer asked for opinions, no longer awaited. He became part of a living past, a reminder that golf once operated differently. People invited him to show respect, to evoke traditional values, but not to shape the future. And in that assigned role, Davis Love III realized he had completed his historical part, even though he was still alive, still sharp, still loving the sport with everything he had. Surviving one's own era is an experience that's hard to describe. There are no applause, no boos, just a prolonged silence where you watch the world keep moving without needing you anymore. Davis Love III didn't try to hold on. He didn't try to prove he was still useful. He had done that his whole life. Instead, he learned to exist in a new role, one not clearly defined, not greatly expected. A role where his presence was more symbolic than functional. There were afternoons when he stood on the practice range, watching young golfers swing with the speed and confidence of the new era, and Davis Love III didn't feel envy. He only felt a quiet sadness. Not because they were better, but because the world they stepped into was different from the one that had shaped him. What he once believed was the core of golf standards, responsibility, silence, under pressure, was now just an option, not a necessity. And in that change, he understood that he had become a witness, no longer the main character. This tragedy has no climax, no explosive moment. It unfolds slowly, year by year, the way eras shed their skin. Davis Love III wasn't abandoned, but he also wasn't needed. He survived, but was no longer placed at the center. And perhaps that was the hardest challenge for a man who had lived his entire life by standards, learning to accept that those standards were no longer the pillar of the world. In that acceptance, he didn't collapse, but he also didn't triumph. He just stood there, like a living relic, carrying the memory of a bygone era, and continued to exist in the silence of a world that had moved on without looking back. Amid golf-changing eras and him gradually drifting from the center of the world he once belonged to, Davis Love III found another space to breathe, not on the course, but in his family, the only place that allowed him to learn how to let go without being seen as weak. His marriage wasn't loud, wasn't turned into a media story, wasn't told as a romantic symbol. It existed in the same durable, quiet way as the man himself. There were no grand declarations, only steady presence, ordinary evenings, repeated habits. After years of living under the harsh schedule of professional golf, family became a slower rhythm, a place where no one kept score, no one measured worth by achievements. But that light, though warm, was still very faint, because it couldn't erase what had been etched in so deeply before. When he became a father, Davis Love III faced a choice he himself had never been given, whether or not to impose the path he had walked on his own child. He understood better than anyone the cost of being born into a pre-programmed destiny. So he tried to do the opposite. He didn't place harsh standards on his child's shoulders, didn't turn golf into an obligation, didn't make every shot a test of worth. When caddying for his son, he walked behind not just literally, but in spirit too. He carried the bag, offered advice when asked, and stayed silent when it wasn't needed. In that role, he learned not to stand higher, not to become the measure, not to repeat the shadow of the father who had once shaped him. That was the first real letting go in his life, and also the hardest. Caddying for his son wasn't a return to the course. It was a way of confronting the past. Every step down the fairway with his child was a reminder of his own childhood, of practice sessions without hugs, of victories treated as duties. Davis Love III tried not to pass on that burden. He spoke less, listened more. He let his son be wrong, let his son be sad, let his son ask questions, but in that effort, he also realized a painful truth. Some wounds don't disappear just because you don't want to pass them on. They don't vanish. They just go quieter, more hidden, lying deeper in the way you react, the way you worry, the way you fear repeating what once hurt you. Family gave Davis Love III a relative sense of peace, but not salvation. He didn't become a completely different person when he stepped off the golf course. The old standards were still there. They just weren't applied so rigidly anymore. He learned to let go little by little, but every letting go came with unease. Letting go meant accepting he couldn't control everything, that his child might take a different path, that success wasn't the only thing worth pursuing. Those lessons came late, and because they came late, they didn't bring relief. They brought restlessness. There were evenings when the house was quiet, and the tournament schedule no longer ruled, and Davis Love III sat alone with himself. No applause, no leaderboard, no data to analyze, just slow thoughts about how he had lived and how he was trying to live differently now. Family didn't erase the pain of the past, but it gave him a place to set it down for a moment. He no longer had to prove he was good enough, at least not in that space. But that rest was fragile, because he knew wounds formed early don't easily disappear. They only quietly change shape from pressure to worry, from discipline to fear, from forced silence to chosen silence. The light of family didn't shine directly or brightly. It was like a dim yellow lamp in a familiar room, enough to see each other, but not enough to erase the shadows. Davis Love III didn't try to inflate his role in the family, nor did he see it as a reward for years of endurance. He saw it as a belated chance to live differently, even knowing that difference was always limited by what had already happened. He no longer stood higher, but he also didn't stand fully level. He still carried the habits of observing, evaluating, self-controlling. Only now, he tried to keep them to himself. The subtle tragedy of this phase lay in this. Davis Love III had learned how to let go, but he was never taught how to let go completely. He understood he shouldn't pass on the burden, but he also understood that burden had become part of who he was. Family helped lighten it, but couldn't remove it from his life. And perhaps he didn't even want that, because in that deeper silence, Davis Love III found a rare form of reconciliation, not with the past, but with the reality that some wounds will stay, and his task now wasn't to heal them, but to make sure they no longer controlled the people he loved. In 2020, when the world slowed because of unforeseen events, a quiet fire entered Davis Love III's life, and did what no injury, no failure, no being forgotten had ever done. It erased the material roots of memory. The house where an entire silent life was stored burned down. Not a loud disaster with sirens and crowds, but a loss that happened so fast that when the smoke cleared, what remained was only ash and a cold emptiness. In those ashes weren't just possessions. There were mementos of the father lost back in 1988. Old clubs, faded photos, handwritten notes from the time when he was a stricter teacher than a father. There were understated trophies carrying a lifetime of endurance, quiet witnesses to a career built on persistence rather than fanfare. All gone in one night, with no chance to choose what to save first. Davis Love III stood before that wreckage not with the posture of someone defeated, but with the familiar silence that had followed him his whole life. He didn't cry in public. He didn't step forward to tell the story as a tragedy to gain sympathy. Because for him, this wasn't just material loss. It was a form of memory erasure, a life preserved in small objects, things never displayed, now burned away by fire. No more photos to look back on youth, no more notes to trace his father's voice, no more trophies to remind that those years of endurance once had form, a life, in the truest sense, erased by fire. Some losses make people scream, some make them go silent. The burned-down house belonged to the second kind. Davis Love III was used to loss without ritual. His father left without goodbye. The big moments of his career brought no release. And now, the material memories left him in a way that gave no preparation. He didn't resist it, because resistance required emotional energy he had learned to conserve long ago. Instead, he stood there, looking at what used to be home, and said one painfully simple sentence: "We still have each other." A sentence that sounded like acceptance, but was really a thin cover for a pain that couldn't be named. "We still have each other" wasn't a declaration of triumph over adversity. It was Davis Love III, reminding himself that something remained untouched by the fire. But the sentence also admitted that so much had vanished forever. The father's mementos, the traces of a past that shaped him, were now gone to touch, gone to see. And for a man who had lived his whole life in silence, those inanimate things had once been the rare bridges between the present and the things never spoken. When those bridges collapsed, the void didn't just grow larger, it became harder to reach. Nothing left to hold, to remind, to confront. Only memory, and memory, without physical proof, becomes far more fragile and painful. Davis Love III didn't turn the burned house into a symbolic story. He didn't say it was liberation from the past, nor did he say it was a chance to start over. He understood that not every loss carries positive meaning. Some losses are simply losses, and this was one of them, a part of life erased without replacement. When the fire took the trophies, it didn't just take metal and shape. It took the feeling that those years of endurance had once left a trace. When the fire took the old notes, it didn't just take paper and ink. It took pieces of his father's voice, instructions never repeated in words. In the days that followed, Davis Love III continued living as he always had, without display, without complaint, without seeking attention. But the change happened inside. When everything material that once anchored memory was destroyed, he was forced to face memory more directly. No objects left to look at, no place to put remembrance. Memory became an empty space where the past appeared suddenly, out of order, without ritual. That was a new challenge, no less heavy than physical injuries or professional failures. And like every other challenge, he didn't speak about it. He carried it quietly, like a scar no one could see. The event of 2020 didn't make Davis Love III collapse, but it made one bitter truth clear. There are things that once lost cannot be rebuilt with discipline or willpower. You can rebuild a house, but you cannot rebuild the things that burned. You can keep living, but you cannot reclaim the pieces of memory that turned to ash. And for a man who had lived his entire life by accumulating bit by bit, that sudden erasure felt like a wordless sentence. A life built slowly, wiped away by fire in an instant. "We still have each other." That sentence continued to be repeated as a way to stay standing. But standing firm didn't mean not hurting. Davis Love III knew that. He didn't need anyone to remind him. He simply chose not to let that pain become a story for the world. Because for him, some losses don't need to be told to be acknowledged. They exist, quietly, and shape who you are from the inside. The burned-down house didn't take away his future, but it took away his past in a way nothing could compensate for. And in the silence after the fire, Davis Love III continued doing what he had done his whole life. Keep walking, not because everything was okay, but because stopping had never been an option he was allowed to have. After the 2020 fire, when the material memories had turned to ash, and there was nothing left to hold on to except a bare present, Davis Love III stepped into another phase of his life. one that no title or willpower could delay. Old age arrived without permission. It didn't knock, didn't warn, didn't come with a clear moment for him to brace himself. It arrived through mornings waking up with back pain already waiting, through the feeling of a body heavier before the mind could fully wake, through simple movements that once were reflexes, now becoming challenges. Each day no longer began as a promise of being able to try just a little more. It became a test of how much longer he could endure, before having to admit there are limits that cannot be negotiated. Chronic back pain didn't erupt like a violent injury, then heal with surgery or long rest. It existed persistently, stubbornly, gnawing at every movement, every intention to stand. Some mornings he sat up very slowly, not from lack of determination, but because his body needed time to allow it. Pain became the background rhythm of life, a low hum always present behind every thought. Davis Love III didn't talk much about it. He was used to not complaining about pain, used to seeing pain as part of the cost for a disciplined life. But that familiarity didn't make the pain lighter. It only made him better at hiding it. No longer being able to push like before was a realization that came very slowly, and because it came slowly, it was even harder to accept. There were swings he knew he couldn't make anymore, not from lack of technique, but because his body wouldn't allow it. There were tournaments he had to decline not because he didn't want to, but because he knew trying would only leave worse consequences. For a man who had lived his whole life by continuing, by never stopping, that refusal carried the feeling of personal failure. No one blamed him, no one forced him, but the very act of voluntarily stepping back forced him to face the hardest question. If I can no longer do what I've done my whole life, then who am I? Accepting a place on the sidelines wasn't a decisive choice, it was a series of small concessions. Step back from one event, rest an extra week, hand the role to someone else. Each step back was reasonable, had a reason, was covered in the language of wisdom and self-care. But added together, they formed an identity shift. Davis Love III didn't disappear from golf, but he was no longer at its center. He appeared more often in observer roles as an advisor, invited for his experience and credibility. And in those roles, he did very well. But doing well didn't mean feeling complete, because completeness, for him, had once been tied to the feeling of standing on the course, taking responsibility for every shot of his own. Learning to lose to his own body was a bitter lesson, with no audience and no closing ceremony. Unlike a failure on the scoreboard, where you can look at the numbers and say, "Today I wasn't good enough," failing against the body gives no clear number. It happens in silence, day by day, small pains accumulating into a big truth. Davis Love III didn't lose his skill first. He lost the absolute trust in his own ability. Every time the body didn't respond, he had to renegotiate with himself, had to accept that willpower was no longer the only deciding factor. And for someone raised in iron discipline, where every problem could be solved with more effort, this was an almost unacceptable reversal. There were very private moments when he stood alone on the practice range, watching young golfers swing with a freedom his body no longer allowed. No fierce jealousy, no resentment. Just a deep, quiet sadness, like seeing a past version of himself now belonging to someone else. Davis Love III didn't blame time. He understood every body has an expiration date, but understanding didn't make acceptance easier. He had once believed that if he did everything right, lived with discipline, didn't waste energy on frivolous things, then his body would repay him with matching durability. Old age shattered that belief without mercy. In the days without competing, his rhythm of life slowed in ways he never imagined before. Mornings no longer rushed with travel schedules. Afternoons no longer pressured by preparing for the next round. That slowing brought a new kind of peace, but it also opened more space for thought. When he no longer had to focus on enduring, he had more time to feel. And in that feeling, questions postponed his whole life began to surface. Were all those years of striving worth it? If in the end the body still says no, did he miss something while pursuing standards to this extent? Davis Love III's old age wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, didn't come with a clear collapse. It was a slow depletion, a draining of energy that happened even as he kept his outward calm. He didn't complain, didn't write a memoir to pour out his heart, didn't stand up to warn the next generation about the cost of durability. He continued to hold silence as a final form of dignity, but in that silence, he learned a lesson he had avoided his whole life. There are matches you cannot win, and winning isn't always the right goal. Learning to lose to his own body didn't turn Davis Love III into a pessimist. It made him more realistic, softer, less harsh with himself. He no longer tried to prove anything to the world. He just tried to live so each day didn't become an unnecessary battle. That acceptance didn't bring great joy, but it brought a rare kind of calm. And in that calm, he realized that the value of life isn't only in how long you can keep going, but also in knowing when to stop, even when stopping doesn't feel like victory. Old age arrived without permission, and Davis Love III had no way to refuse it. He could only open the door, face it, and learn to live with it, not as a surrender, but as someone who had gone far enough to understand that some limits aren't for overcoming, they're for respecting. And in that belated respect, he didn't find salvation, but he found a rare honesty with himself, that losing to the body didn't make him less. It only reminded him that he too was human, and in the end, had to pay the price for a life built on discipline and silence. When old age forced him to the sidelines and his body no longer allowed him to push like before, Davis Love III faced another quiet but distinctly painful truth. His legacy isn't sung. There is no historic moment replayed endlessly with his name attached. There is no big story told to later generations as an indisputable legend. When American golf looks back at itself, Davis Love III rarely appears at the center of collective memory. He isn't completely forgotten, but he is remembered in the faintest way, as a good man. Good man sounds respectful, but it's also the quickest way for a life to slip out of the big stories. It's a safe label, uncontroversial, not stirring strong emotion. A good man has no edges, no explosive tragedy, no moment that changes the course of history. Davis Love III was placed in that frame naturally, because he never broke the order, never turned himself into a loud icon. But because of that, his legacy isn't loud enough to be remembered long in a world that only remembers what shocks. Not being called a legend isn't because he lacked achievements. He won enough, contributed enough, was present long enough to be ranked among the great names. But golf, like every other sport, doesn't just remember numbers. It remembers stories. And Davis Love III's story was too proper to spark curiosity, too steady to create legend. He had no iconic confrontation with his era, no rebellious moment to define himself. He went straight, durable, and silent. Those qualities helped him last a very long time, but they didn't help him become a separate chapter in the big book of golf history. In conversations, when people mention him, the tone is always full of respect. A great golfer, a man of integrity, an exemplary leader. But those words rarely come with excitement. They're like footnotes at the bottom of the page necessary to complete the picture, but not the part that makes readers pause longer. Davis Love III isn't told in the big stories not because he doesn't deserve it, but because he doesn't fit the storytelling structure the era prefers. He doesn't represent a revolution. He represents an order that once worked very well and then quietly gave way. The tragedy of a legacy remembered the wrong way lies in this. What truly made up his value is precisely the things that are hardest to tell. Doing things right in silence doesn't create climaxes. Carrying responsibility without demanding credit doesn't create images. Living by standards without showmanship doesn't create legends. Davis Love III lived his whole life that way, and the price of that choice was a legacy not loud enough to survive long in collective memory. People may remember the iconic shots of others, but find it hard to remember the steady years he maintained to keep the sport from slipping off its standards. There is a bitter paradox here. The ones remembered long are often the ones who disrupted order, while those who kept order quickly dissolve into the background. Davis Love III was the keeper of order. He didn't make golf more chaotic so he could be recorded as a game changer. He made golf stand firm, even when no one noticed it needed holding steady. And when the era changed, people talked about those who pushed it farther, not about the one who kept it from collapsing for so many years. A lifetime of standards lived in silence leaves a feeling that's hard to name. Not resentment, because Davis Love III never demanded praise. Not bitterness, because he understood the price of silence from the beginning. But there is a quiet sadness in realizing that what you lived and protected may only be remembered as a minor detail, not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't fit the way the world tells stories about itself. In a culture that celebrates difference and noise, standards become the hardest thing to preserve in memory. Davis Love III didn't stand up to reclaim a place for his legacy. He didn't edit the story, didn't demand history, look back at him differently. He continued his silence, as he had his whole life. But that silence doesn't mean his legacy doesn't exist. It exists in the way generations of golfers are taught about responsibility, in the moral standards that don't need to be written into law, in the right decisions that bring no applause. The only thing is, those things are hard to turn into compelling stories, hard to package into legends. The tragedy of being remembered the wrong way isn't complete oblivion, it's being remembered without the true depth. Davis Love III will be mentioned as a good man, but rarely as someone who carried so much in silence. He will be remembered as a consistent golfer, but seldom as someone who lived fully with discipline to the point of erasing himself from the spotlight. And perhaps that's something he accepted very early. When you choose silence as your way of existing, you also have to accept that silence will be how the world remembers you. A lifetime of standards doesn't leave a big echo, but it leaves a solid foundation. It's just a shame that foundations are rarely gazed upon. Davis Love III walked through his life with rare consistency, and that very consistency kept him from becoming a legend in the usual way. His legacy isn't sung, isn't celebrated in big stories. It lies there, quietly, like the man himself, waiting for those patient and honest enough to see the value of a life that didn't need noise to mean something. At age 61, after understanding that his legacy isn't sung and perhaps never will be told through big stories, Davis Love III stands before a reality with no room left for dramatic hope. He isn't saved. There is no resurrection to wait for, no comeback to make the crowd explode, no belated honor moment where history turns back and admits they overlooked him. All those possibilities, if they ever existed, quietly closed along with the strength of his body and the unrelenting movement of the era. What remains isn't an icon, but a very real man who has reached the end of the path he chose and has nothing left to prove. No resurrection, because he never collapsed in a way that allowed a spectacular rise. Davis Love III's life had no deep bottom to bounce back from, no abyss to emerge from like a returning warrior. He only had a long, steady line, where every step drained a portion of vitality, emotion, youth. No comeback, because he never left in a shocking way. He drifted to the edge slowly, reasonably, without leaving a gap big enough for the world to call him back. And there is no belated honor moment, because this era has no habit of looking back at those who chose silence as their way of living. At age 61, Davis Love III stands on no high podium. He also doesn't lie defeated at the feet of history. He stands in a harder-to-describe place, the middle ground between presence and withdrawal. He is still recognized, but no longer awaited, still respected, but no longer expected from. What once defined him, discipline, standards, responsibility, is no longer a promise for the future. It's a summary of a life already past. And in that summary, there is no line about miracles. There is a special loneliness when you've done everything right, paid the full price, but received no symbolic reward. Davis Love III wasn't treated cruelly by history, but he also wasn't favored by it. History simply passed by him, acknowledging just enough not to be called unfair, but not deeply enough to be called gratitude. At this age, he understands that not every enduring life gets retold as a triumph. Some lives are simply lived, and living them fully is itself the price paid. Only one man left, with no roles left to cling to, no tournament schedule to shape the rhythm of life, no collective responsibility to carry in place of personal emptiness, only mornings waking with familiar pain, slow passing afternoons, and quiet evenings where memories arrive uninvited. Davis Love III doesn't complain about it. He's used to not asking why me, but familiarity doesn't make the feeling lighter. It only makes him better at enduring. He paid the full price for durability, but durability brings no clear reward. It has no separate medal, no moment of being named. The price of durability is paid gradually, through prolonged back pain, through silent withdrawals, through watching the world move forward without needing him anymore. Davis Love III paid that price every day, without shortfall, without evasion. And now, with the bill fully settled, he receives nothing back but stark quiet. At age 61, no salvation comes from outside, no new title to redefine the past, no collective apology for the forgetting. If there is any form of salvation, it can only come from within, and even that is uncertain. Davis Love III doesn't try to convince himself that everything has a beautiful reason. He understands that some lives aren't closed with complete meaning, but with the acceptance that meaning isn't always granted. Preparing for an absolutely tragic ending doesn't mean preparing for collapse. For Davis Love III, it's preparation for an ending without noise, without climax, without explanation. An ending where all the big questions have been lived through, but not necessarily answered. He doesn't wait for someone to come and say he's done enough, that he deserves more than what he got. He's heard enough of those assessments throughout his life, and he understands they don't change the core feeling, that he has walked the entire path, and that path promised no glorious turn at the end. Perhaps the most painful thing at age 61 isn't the decline of the body, but the clarity of awareness. Davis Love III knows his story won't be rewritten differently. The narrative is almost fixed, not because of lack of effort, but because that effort wasn't designed to create legend. He lived as a keeper of standards, and the world rarely builds statues for those who keep standards. They're necessary, but not celebrated. And so, at age 61, Davis Love III stands there not saved, but also not fallen. No resurrection, no comeback, no belated honor, only a man who has paid the full price for durability and is learning to keep living without expecting a different ending. The absolute tragedy doesn't lie in him losing everything. It lies in him having nothing left to wait for except continuing to exist honestly with himself. In that honesty, there are no lights, no music, only a life slowly closing exactly the way it was lived, quietly, with discipline, and asking nothing more from a world that has passed him by. After everything he's been through, after accepting there is no resurrection, no belated honor, no one knocking on history's door to say he deserved more, Davis Love III enters the final segment of his life, the way he lived from the beginning. No miracles, no explanations, no apology from fate, no symbolic closing moment to make people stand and applaud, no soundtrack to soften the weight. Just one very real person, standing in the midst of ordinary life, carrying everything he ever endured, and not demanding the world understand or acknowledge it. That man has endured enough expectations from before he even understood who he was. enough discipline to the point where emotion became secondary, enough loss when his father left without a final word of acknowledgement, enough of a steady career that wasn't loud enough to be passionately loved, enough prolonged physical pain he wasn't allowed to display, enough collective responsibility with nowhere to set it down, and finally, enough of the gentle but persistent forgetting from a world that only remembers what shakes it. No chapter in his life was written with ease, but no chapter was written with complaint either. No miracles, because his life wasn't built to wait for miracles. Everything he had came from doing things right, doing enough, and keeping going even when no one was watching. No explanations, because some lives can't be summed up in a neat message. Davis Love III isn't a ready-framed moral lesson. He's a consistent chain of choices, and that very consistency makes his story hard to tell, hard to sell, hard to celebrate. No apology from fate, because fate never admitted it wronged him. It simply passed by, took pieces away, and left him standing there still sharp enough to understand, still dignified enough not to blame. Only one man left, no roles left, no titles left to defend, no image left to maintain. Davis Love III doesn't step out of the lights feeling robbed. He steps out feeling he has completed his part. He lived true to what he believed was right, even when that right didn't bring deserved remembrance. He didn't bend himself to fit the era, didn't turn himself into a louder version to be named. He kept his true shape and accepted the price that came with it, not being remembered enough. There is a subtle pain in knowing you did things right, but that right isn't retold much. Not the pain of failure, but the pain of quietness. Davis Love III understands that at an age when understanding no longer brings comfort, he doesn't expect history to turn back. He doesn't rewrite the story. He just keeps living, carrying the truth that some values don't last long in collective memory, even when they once kept an entire system from collapsing. He was one of those values. The heavy ending of this life doesn't lie in explosive tragedy, but in the absence of release. No moment where everything suddenly becomes clearly meaningful. No complete answer to the question, was it worth it? Davis Love III wasn't granted the feeling that every sacrifice was finally repaid. Instead, he was granted a starker truth. Living right doesn't guarantee being remembered right, and he had to teach himself to accept that not as surrender, but as a final form of honesty with himself. He looks back on his life not with fierce regret, but with a deep weariness. Weary from walking too long without symbolic rest stops. Weary from carrying too much without a moment to set it down. But in that weariness, one thing can't be denied. He didn't betray himself. Davis Love III didn't become someone else to be loved more. He didn't trade his silence for applause. He lived true to his inner structure and accepted that structure didn't fit the way the world honors heroes. When all the stories close, when nothing more can be added, only the simplest and heaviest truth remains. He didn't lose. He simply lived in a world that had no place for the silent ones. The story of Davis Love III leaves a quiet sadness, not because he lacked glory, but because he lived fully within a value system that modern society has less and less patience to listen to. From being born just one day after his father's Masters round, his life was programmed by golf, by discipline, by duty. The greatest tragedy wasn't the accident that took his father in 1988. It was that he never got the chance to hear one final word of acknowledgement. From then on, golf was no longer a choice. It became the only tether keeping him from collapse. Even when he won the 1997 PGA Championship, the moment that should have been liberating, he still stood in an empty room, because the only person he wanted to witness it was already gone. Davis Love III's career was great enough to be respected, but not dramatic enough to be passionately loved. He created no scandals, represented no cultural rebellion, so when golf entered the era of data and commerce, he became a living relic. No one removed him, but no one needed him either. The chronic back injuries, the house burned down in 2020, taking his father's mementos, and the quiet process of aging showed a man who paid the full price for durability without receiving an apology from fate. For the American people, the lesson from this story is very clear. Society cannot only celebrate the loud and the shocking while forgetting those who uphold standards, carry responsibility, and live right in silence. Davis Love III reminds us that success doesn't always come with remembrance, and living right doesn't guarantee being told right. But it is precisely in that silence that he left a profound value, dignity, responsibility, and honesty with oneself, things that never go out of style, even when they aren't sung. If the story of Davis Love III makes you pause to think about people who lived right but weren't remembered enough, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling those silent but deeply valuable journeys. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video where we'll dive even deeper into those great destinies that don't need noise.